All right, it's 2 past, and I see numbers have stabilized with the participants. So I would like to welcome everyone to this session today on understanding supply chain risks in Europe. As you can see or not see, we have an issue with the GoToWebinar platform about the cameras, which is the reason why you can't see our faces. Apologies for that. But you will see a picture of the presenters shortly when I present the panelists. So as a quick intro, this is the first of a three-part series on supply chains that are designed to empower you with the knowledge and strategies to decarbonize and manage supply chain risks. Hence, make sure that you also dial in the next two webinar sessions coming up in the next 2 weeks. My name is Anja Moser. I'm a sustainability advisor based in Zurich, and I will be your host today. As you are probably all are familiar, Scope 3 emissions, which include your supply chain, meaning emissions that are the result of activities from assets not owned or controlled by your organization, are on average 25 times higher than your operational emissions. Despite this significant size, the importance of supply chains in a more and more connected world, as shown during supply chain interruptions during the COVID crisis, as well as Scope 3 and supply chain emissions being crucial in achieving our climate targets, not enough attention is yet placed upon this topic. And this is why we decided to do this webinar series. So in the next 45 minutes, we will cover how to understand the climate risks in your supply chain and what risks your supply chain is exposed to. We will touch upon what specific challenges we see commonly appearing with regards to managing climate risks. And we'll also look into how these challenges can be addressed with a concrete use case. In the end, we will have a Q&A session covering your questions. And in case we are not able to cover all your questions, don't worry, we will respond after the session in a written form. And we will also share, since this question has already come up in the Q&A area, all the slides. So moving on to the next slide, to a little bit of housekeeping. You're all muted, but please post any questions in the Q&A box, and we will answer some of these during the end of the session. And as mentioned, we will answer any that we will not get to in a follow-up. Everyone will receive the documentation together with the document containing all questions and answers. So keep an eye out in your email boxes. On to the next slide, and finally you can see our pictures. Joining me today is my South Pole colleague, Dr. Nico Kroner, and he's a climate risk expert working with me here in Zurich as well. And then Sebastian Blink, CEO and founder of CLIMADA, a globally operating climate risk analytics company bringing opportunity to climate adaptation. And with that, and without further ado, I would like to hand over to Nico already to start with setting the scene on climate risks, what they entail, and why they are non-negligible for your business. Over to you, Nico.
Great. Thank you, Anja, and also welcome from my side. So when we talk about climate risks, I think it's important first to understand what we think about when we talk about climate risks, right? So climate risks can be separated into two major categories. One are physical climate risks and the other one are transition risks. Both can have impacts and lead to losses and damages to your own organization, also via affecting your supply chain. And if we talk about physical risks, we are really talking about how the climate might change due to greenhouse gas in the atmosphere and our emissions to the atmosphere, and how they are impacting the climate. And we have an increase, for example, in heat waves or droughts or also heavy precipitation events. But on the other side, when we talk about climate and the potential impacts it can have on an organization, we also talk about transition risks, right? And transition risks are really linked to this, we all work towards, right, this goal of having a low carbon economy, but obviously with the low carbon economy, there are also certain risks attached to it. Also, obviously, certain opportunities attached to it, to this transition to a low carbon economy. And it's important to understand both the physical risks as well as the transition risks. a key thing I would like to say is that those risks are obviously depending a little bit on the region you're operating in, right? Especially if you think about the global supply chain, you will be easily subject to different types of these risks depending on the region you're looking at. So here, just a global map of a hypothetical company, let's say a clothing manufacturer, and the different risks that can be faced in different areas of the world. For example, in the cotton regions in Asia, where we could see risks due to heat waves and droughts and tropical cyclones. But also globally a risk, obviously, from legislation around carbon pricing and what this could mean for the company if the company is not prepared to deal with the potential carbon prices. So after we have established what climate risks really are, I think it's important to say why should we care? Why should we understand them? Why should we manage, and why should we disclose climate risks? And the key thing for why are really four main points. Obviously is compliance and lots of upcoming regulations that we see. So really to comply with these regulations, we need to have a good understanding of the climate risks that a company is facing directly as well as in its supply chain. But it's not just the regulations, it's also the expectations of different stakeholders to see that a corporate is addressing those risks and also those opportunities. But besides this kind of this external driver, right, either regulations or stakeholder expectations, a very more internally driven and also very important point is around really creating business resilience. But only if I understand and are able to quantify these risks, I can really manage them, and because of that really also generate a competitive advantage against other business that don't see these risks, are not able to manage them as well. And obviously today we're talking a bit more about the risk side. The webinar is also supply chain risks, but it's not only about risks, it's also about understanding respective opportunities. So it's very important to also use such an analysis to get a better understanding of opportunities that arise with climate change. I quickly talked about regulations, and given that we are focusing today on Europe, there are a few key regulations in the region that are really important. Obviously, I guess, and you know, most of them is the CSRD, really pushing towards a more holistic view on not just climate, but different topics. But scenario analysis and climate risk assessment is a key part of the CSRD as well. Also, it's a key part within the EU taxonomy if we talk around adaptation or the do no significant harm criteria on adaptation. Again, their climate scenario analysis is an important part, and it's important also to do that holistically and include the supply chain. Then other important regulations that needs to be taken into consideration, specifically here in Switzerland, is the Swiss Ordinance on Climate Disclosure, which is also asking companies since this year now to disclose climate information in alignment with the TCFD. And again, their climate scenario analysis is a key part of it. So also here it's important to do such an analysis. And a bit longer already there and effective is the CFD in the UK, which also mandates scenario analysis to understand climate risk and opportunities. Now that we have established kind of what it is and why we should really care about it, we quickly want to look at how one can go about managing and assessing climate risk and opportunities. And this will be a little bit more high level. In a second, we go into more concrete case studies so that you can see how this works out when it is applied. But on a more high level bird's eye view, there are 4 key steps really to go about understanding and performing scenario analysis. The first step is identify. So it's always about starting relatively broad and get a good understanding on which types of risk and opportunities am I facing, because it's a broad topic, right? Transition risks, they are further divided into regulatory risks, policy risks, reputational risks. So there are lots of different topics at play here. On the same side, on the physical risk side, you have heat waves, droughts, tropical cyclones. So it's really a big zoo of different risks and opportunities. So it's really important in the beginning to develop a good long list and a good understanding which of those could even affect me. I mean, a few of those are not relevant at all, right? And then if I have this good starting point, I can really start to go into the assess stage where I use scenario data to understand how these risks are changing in the future. It's good to understand the risk that I'm facing today, right? But it's important to use climate scenarios to understand how these risks might change in the future under different climate scenarios and therefore different assumptions on how the future will develop. And with that, I get a first good overview and robust assessment of these different risks. And then I need to get one step more into the weeds, right? This is when it is about quantifying the risks. There's a strong push from the regulation also now to really do this financial quantification. What we always say is be careful, don't jump to the quantification too quickly because this should be done in a robust way. You don't want to do that for a million different risks and opportunities because then you just do all a little bit but nothing really well. So it's important after the assess step to really see where are my key vulnerabilities and where does it make sense to spend the time and effort to really do a more detailed analysis and understand the financial impacts. And if I have done these financial impact assessments, I'm also able to manage, right? To manage those risks, understand potential adaptation and mitigation opportunities, and also really develop a cost-benefit view on, for example, my mitigation strategies or also my different adaptation actions that I can take. Now this thing looks a little bit like a straight line, but reality is never a straight line, right? Quite often what we see with clients, maybe you go into the quantification stage and you still realize, oh, something was missed at the assess stage. So you go back to assess and redo it. Or even during the management stage, you really realize, okay, for some risks, I have lots of opportunities to manage them. So maybe they are not as important as I thought in the beginning. And I maybe go back into the quantify or even the assess step to integrating this additional knowledge that I have. So just be warned, it looks a bit nice here as a straight line, but I think it's really more a circular approach. And I think with that, just quickly handing over to you, Anja.
Thanks a lot, Nico, for your inputs. We will now go one level deeper and specifically look at specific supply chain challenges that can arise and how you can address and mitigate them. So back to you, Nico.
Great, thank you, Anja. So as I said, it would be nice, and I think it's benefiting also, and I hope it's in your interest that we go, after having this bird's eye view, going a bit more into the details, like what are key challenges that you see if you follow this process and now you integrate your supply chain because you have done a good job on your own operations. Let's say you want to go into your supply chain, but then there are certain challenges that jump at you. And these are things that we see with our clients. So we have a few examples here on that. One challenge that we see is it's too much data. Interesting to say, right? Often it's not enough, but sometimes it's also too much, right? So instead of a few hundred sites, it's suddenly a few thousand sites that need to be analyzed and understood to really get a good understanding of potential climate risk and opportunities. And what we have done to really kind of address this issue with having like this huge amount of different sites and this issue of really having a good overview is to really use a digital tool to address this challenge on too much data. Because with such a digital tool, you are able to do a systematic screening across, for example, all of these 1,000 different sites, and then really make sure you are able to use a smart way of filtering and setting specific metrics in an online dashboard that then allows to really understand where are key hotspots in terms of the exposure to different physical risks. And with such an online dashboard, you're then really able to go across multiple hazards and across multiple scenarios and time horizons to get a good understanding where is my exposure today, but also how is this exposure and the risk due to different physical risk changing in the future. And then what we saw, what is also really important, is that this is not something static, but it has a certain dynamic to it. So if there's something changing in the supply chain, there's an easy way to add additional locations and to run additional analysis on that and also integrate it into the overall picture. With the key goal really here to generate a robust understanding on the most material physical risks that the company is facing, but also that it is facing within its supply chain, right? So really get an understanding, okay, within my supply chain, the biggest risk I'm facing is, for example, heat waves, or the key risk that I am facing given my filtering on my key suppliers' factories. I, for example, understand that one of my key risks is due to riverine flooding, and riverine flooding affecting those facilities where I really rely on their supply. And if I have then understood these details, I can really start to dig even deeper and understand what could be the financial impacts. And with this, I would like to hand over to Sebastian to really talk a little bit more about how we can do these financial quantifications.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nico, and nice to be here. Hello, everybody. It reminds me a little bit on the back to the COVID days when we had those clubhouse sessions with only voice and no camera, so a little bit different experience, but nice. So the challenge here we want to face is the financial quantification part. So let's assume we have identified certain hotspots already with a systematic check, like Nico was going through already. And we really want to understand now impact. And I would like to, before jumping already to a financial impact, I really want to like to guide you through a process here on behalf of an example we have done together with the client in the technology area, in the technology hardware area, analyzing their supply chain risks. And that's exactly what we want to do here now. If we go to the next slide, please. This is showing you here how it really works at the end. So we start, and in this concrete example, we have looked specifically on river floods, as this is one of the key hazards which are impacting the production, for example, but also the entire supply chain here. By the way, wind and flood are the main hazards which have an impact or substantial impact on physical objects or infrastructure. So that's why we start always with the exposure. So how is the company exposed to those hazards, but also how are the suppliers exposed to those hazards? So what we need to know is where are the locations, where are the assets, both again from the company and the main suppliers ideally. We then analyze how hazards are changing. First of all, how is the risk at the moment? How is intensity and frequency of those hazards, in this case flood, and how is it changing given climate change is happening in the next years to come? And then the key area is this entire area about vulnerability assessment. So, and here we need to understand more in detail the sector of the company, because a lot depends on the sector in the industry a company is active in order to understand the vulnerabilities. And that, once we have an understanding about the vulnerabilities of the company, of the buildings, but also of the supply chain, we can translate that into impacts. And you will see we have an impact on what does that mean in terms of downtime of factories, for example, and then what does it mean for in terms of downtime in financial losses. So those are usually the steps we are taking with the client through the entire process. Now, concretely spoken, we have analyzed here, as I said earlier, a technology company in China. So we had a look at their exposure data. So you see here a part of China, or entire China, with more than 1,000 locations we have analyzed. including the supply. So this is not only the company sites you see here on the map. So you see we have clustered also the buildings or facilities in different types, depending on what you have there, like logistics centers, inventory sites, or where also certain production components are delivered from. And this is then also relevant when it comes to importance or potential losses in the supply chain. So you see we have clustered that here, the entire exposure data in different ways, and use that as a base for our further analysis. Now, in the next step, we did the entire hazard modeling in detail. That concretely means we looked at different climate scenarios. And again, we focused here now in this presentation on the slides, we are focusing on river flood risks. So we analyzed how the risk of river floods changes over time in different scenarios. Concretely, what you see here on the slide is the flood level for a 1 in 100-year flood event in 2050 under RCP 8.5, and RCP 8.5 means a warming between 4 and 5 degrees until 2100. And on what you see here is we were interested mainly what is the likelihood of those locations being flooded. So the criteria we set here is the flood height or the flood level needs to be more than 0.2 meters, that it is really relevant or counts as a flood event for that specific location. So that's what we have done here to get an understanding how is the flood level of each site in the future under warmer conditions, which means an increase of frequency and intensity of such kind of events. And then in the next step, we went into the impact assessment. So what you have seen on the previous slide are the projected flood heights. We also can get from the data and the hazard modeling the flood fraction. So what is the amount of flooded in a certain area. And then we worked here very closely together with the client to get an understanding about vulnerabilities. And that really depends heavily on, again, building characteristics you need to take into consideration. So what kind of buildings we're talking about, how old are they, what material has been used, how high is the building, what's the level of the ground floor, all that kind of building characteristics are important. And but we then simplified that and distinguish here between low vulnerability and high vulnerabilities at the end, which gives us an understanding about what could be a worst case downtime for highly vulnerable buildings and what could be a best case downtime. And you see here in the equation on the top of the slide, if you combine all of that, we can translate that. So we combine at the end the hazard information with the vulnerability information of the buildings in order to translate that into expected downtimes. And that's what you see here on the lower part of the slide. We have done that again for the RCP 8.5 scenario, for the 4-degree scenario. And we have looked at 2 different type steps, 2030 and 2050. And then we have also analyzed 2, let's say, different frequencies, so return periods in events, so less likely and more likely events. And you see here that, and at the same time, we have done it for low vulnerability and high vulnerability. So that's exactly the matrix you see here. And you see at the end that the average downtime ranges from roughly 2 to 5 months of downtime, given the flood events we have calculated for those areas, which means really a lot of time in terms of the downtimes of those factories. And this is exactly the piece of information we can deliver for different scenarios, different time steps, as you see here on the slide. And then we work very closely together with the client in order to translate that into financial impacts. This is something where we also need the expertise from the company, from the risk engineers there, who can translate that usually easily in what that means in terms of if the factory or the supplier can't deliver for that amount of time, what does that mean in terms of revenue losses, for example? Another impact possibility is on the next slide, where we also calculated the inventory damage. So it follows more or less the same logic as we have seen before. So we use as a basis the projected flood heights and the flood fraction, and we work here with the damage factor and the figure of the 1 year inventory value. And then we can translate that in expected financial losses in terms of here inventory damage, assuming what is the average value in those at those locations. And you see here the numbers again. We have done that for the RCP 8.5 scenario for 2 different time steps in the future, 2030 and 2050. And what we have done here is given the also the expected downtimes you have seen before, we have that done for either 1 day or an entire month, what that means in terms of damages. And you see that is quite significant, ranging between 155,000 and roughly 7 million. So this is a way of quantifying financial impact on your supply chain. If you have also, and Nico mentioned that before, have a lot of data available. So that means you need to know where the locations are. You need to have additional information about the sites we need to analyze, and then you obviously need to know a little bit more about your business in order to translate that into financial impacts. The other case could be, and that's something we go into now, the challenge if you don't have a lot of data. We also face that with clients where they struggle with getting relevant information about the suppliers and the information where their assets are located and things like that. Therefore, we come up with a solution which is called an input-output model, and it really depends a little bit on what is available in terms of information. So first of all, what is an input-output model? An input-output model is at the end an economic framework where you translate how different, or where you link basically how different sectors are linked or not linked, so how dependent they are to each other. And you map the output from one sector and how that sector serves as an input for other sectors, also across countries. And you use here for also publicly available global tables about those dependencies. And you use it for supply chain risk, high-level supply chain risk analysis, for example, where you want to understand how certain extreme weather events disrupt an entire supply chain. So, for example, you have a flood event causing damages at the production site, and that leads to immediate losses of production, but also has knock-on effects across suppliers and buyers cascading through the entire supply chain. So, and if you know, for example, the market share of a certain supplier in a certain region, you can work with this input-output model to translate that into a high-level supply chain analysis. So we use that kind of input-output model with those global tables in order to model the impacts across different sectors and countries. And again, the more information you have available, the better. But this one is more if you have only high-level information available. With that, I hand back to Nico.
Great, thank you, Sebastian. So the last challenge that we want to look at, and I will try to be relatively quick, so we also have time in the end to answer some of your questions. But if you have listened carefully so far, I guess maybe some of you are wondering, okay, we only talked about physical risks so far. We didn't talk about any transition risk, or how we like to call it, transition events that could obviously also impact your supply chain. And so the last minutes that we have before we go into questions, I would like to just quickly talk about also those events and how you could analyze transition risks or transition events that are affecting a supply chain. And what we have here is a case from a large industrial client who were wondering about, so they use a lot of steel and iron in their production, and they were wondering about the changes of procurement costs of steel and iron for their own profitability and revenue going into the future. And then, similar to what you see before with the financial quantification for physical risks, we have these 4 steps that are important to analyze. Maybe a few key differences here in comparison to what Sebastian showed before. We have here the sensitivity, which is replacing the vulnerability. One reason for that is that within the CSRD, they made the decision to call vulnerability sensitivity instead. So it's important to keep that in mind. So here we also call it sensitivity. And then instead of a hazard, which would be the river flooding event, for example, that Sebastian discussed before, we are talking here about a transition event, which could, for example, be a CO2 tax that is introduced, and because of that increases production costs of certain raw material. On the other side, we still have the exposure and the impact similarly to the analysis that was presented before. Key thing to see is here really for the exposure, we really need to understand what's the volume of steel and iron sourced today, and what is the scenario in terms of how this volume of will change in the future, given different growth assumptions from the company. The second thing is, we said on the sensitivity side, we said it's important to understand the sourcing strategy, which is really about, okay, how much conventional steel and iron is sourced versus innovative steel and iron. And when we talk about innovative, we really mean steel and iron with a lower carbon intensity than conventional steel and iron. And again, this is important to understand today, but it's also important to make a projection into the future to understand how the strategy might change, so that we can understand the costs but also benefits of such a change in strategy. And in a transition event, it's all about understanding how the cost of production within steel and iron might change in the future. And here we used 2 scenarios. One is the net zero scenario of the IEA, so really the scenario that is pushing the whole global economy to a low carbon world, and understanding how then the price for steel and iron might change, but also comparing it with a STEPS scenario. So a bit only the stated policy scenario, which is less strict than the net zero scenario. And using those different scenarios and the projections of that I mentioned before within the exposure and the sensitivity, we were able to understand the impact of these changes in the overall costs for procurement of steel and iron, and also what's the benefit of changing the strategy depending on different future scenarios. As I said, we are nearing the end, and then we want to have some time for questions. So I want to just wrap up quickly here with a few key points to take away from the webinar today. I think we started with a bit of an overall overview about climate risks. And here I think it's really important to say, follow a robust process to assess climate risks within your own organization, but also within the supply chain. So that goes hand in hand, and it's important that it is done robustly together. There are tools out there that help to do risk analysis relatively systematically. So using these digital tools to really do that on a large scale. But then it's also important to zoom in into specific cases like the one that Sebastian now presented, to be really able to do a financial quantification. And I think Sebastian mentioned it during some of his presentation. I said it at some point in time, but it wasn't highlighted a lot before. Always here it's important to get your stakeholders engaged, right? Because either stakeholders in terms within your supply chain, but also within the company, to really get the necessary information to make an overall robust assessment. And with those key takeaways, I give it back to you, Anja, to see if you can ask a few of the questions that have been sent in the list so far. Anja, can you still hear us? Still busy collecting questions. Okay. Then if maybe Anja has troubles to get some of the questions or has troubles with the with GoToWebinar in the background, I will start with a question. So I jump into the role of a moderator and will ask a question to you, Sebastian. Maybe a question here would be, can you showed really nicely, right, that you looked at different points, different assets, right? But what about like roads or train lines or something like that? Are you also able to look at these type of a bit more complicated geographical patterns in an analysis?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question. Yes, indeed. I mean, the focus is always in the beginning on points like really assets and geo coordinates of those assets. But indeed, we can also work with lines like streets or railway tracks and so on. So we work with that. We either use infrastructure data there, so which is publicly available, or we need the polygon information, so the geospatial information about this. I mean, also if you think about production of, for example, crop yield and so on, you might be interested in the fields there. We have done such kind of cases as well, or to use here the language from logistic companies, trade lines. So where are important lines where you move goods from a location A to a location B. So with logistics companies, for example, we are looking at those things, most important trade lines. So the answer is yes. We can also work with other geospatial information than just local points. Maybe quickly, Anja, are you back again? Otherwise, I will do the same thing to Nico and look at the questions we have received so far and ask one question to Nico. Anja, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this is weird, but I'm glad it works. So yeah, let's go on to the second question. It's a bit more of a specific one as well, for you, Sebastian. Sorry, for Nico. Do you have examples around how transition risks can impact companies, and could you give some additional examples on what was already mentioned in the webinar?
Yes, definitely. And good that you're back, Anja. Yes, super happy to give a few additional examples, right? So I think we talked about carbon intensive materials or products and within the supply chain and how they can impact your own operations via an increase in overall procurement costs. That was the one we discussed. But there are also three other examples. One is around an increase in demand for certain materials, right? So if you think about the transition to a low carbon economy, there are certain materials, for example, like copper, that we see where we expect the demand to further increase, and there might be certain shortages at some point in time that could also lead to rising prices of those materials. A bit related to that is also risks in terms of like production capacities that are limited. We have seen that when we work with, for example, wind turbine operators, where there's a question around the production of wind turbines, and there's only so much capacity in the moment, so the market is really starved on that, for example. And maybe the last point on transition risk that is also important to look at is certain cluster risks. So if there are certain raw materials that become extremely important to support a transition, and these raw materials can only be sourced from specific regions or countries, you obviously create a certain cluster risk, because if something geopolitical or whatever happens in those specific regions, you might also generate a shortage of this material, which can affect companies down the line of this supply chain. Thank you, Anja.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Nico. I would like to ask another one that came in to Sebastian. In terms of regulations again, is it mandatory to quantify risks according to the CSRD for the supply chain?
Thanks for that one. I saw that came up multiple times here. So the short answer is yes. It is mandatory, and it's part of the analysis required by CSRD and EU taxonomy. The question is a little bit the level of detail here, and this is exactly what we try to cover here in this presentation today, right? That we can do both ends, so to say. And what we also see currently with clients, for example, in Germany, where we do that kind of analysis where clients don't have the detailed information available, we work with this input-output model approach where we try to get an understanding of what is the market share of that company in that sector, where do they get the certain goods or articles from, and do this input-output assessment on a higher level, rather than the detailed assessment I was presenting here as the concrete use case from this technology provider. So long answer, but I just want to give a little bit of flavor how companies deal with that challenge at the moment. But yes, it's part of the regulatory requirements.
Fantastic. So we have time for one very short answer and question. Let's go maybe a bit more specific again. I'm not sure whether this has already been answered, but can you analyze also other things than asset points like roads, Sebastian?
Yeah, that's the one we had already.
Okay, wonderful. Sorry. Okay, wonderful. Then we take the next one coming in. Is it possible to quantify indirect losses? So, for example, labor productivity?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge area, indirect impacts. I mean, if you think about it from a direct impact perspective, right? This is the common denominator, so to say, are buildings. So this is and a building is there's a high overlap of different industries owning buildings. So this is much more straightforward or straight through. Indirect impacts is super sector dependent, as I said earlier. So labor productivity is another one which is maybe a little bit more relevant across different sectors, where we analyze heat patterns and what does that mean in terms of people working outside or commuting to certain locations. And maybe also the factory downtimes we have seen in the presentation is one which is overlapping. And then you have a huge amount of indirect impacts affecting different industries. If you think about renewable energy production or energy consumption because you need to air condition more or whatever, right? So this is a huge field we are covering, but it can go quite quickly more bespoke if you think about certain industries and company-related questions.
Fantastic. Unfortunately, we've already reached full hour or the 45 minutes, so time is up. But thanks again to both of you, Nico and Sebastian, for your insights and also to the audience for listening in. As said, we will send the slides and also answer all the questions that were unanswered so far. But we do hope that you enjoyed the session and that you could draw some insightful things out from it. I'd also like if you could go one slide further to thank all the South Pole clients participating and of course all the clients to be as well. For anyone not yet familiar with South Pole, we are a carbon asset developer and global full-service climate consultancy working on climate action since 2006 and do partner with clients throughout their climate journey from crafting decarbonization and climate risk strategies over to implementing climate action and understanding nature and unlocking finances. So if you need support or have further questions after we answer the questions that came in, please feel free to contact us. Thanks again to everyone for joining and hopefully speak to you soon.